For more on this, I am joined by our foreign affairs editor, Philip Turle. Good morning, Philip.
Good morning, Erin.
So is Iranian Kurdistan paying the highest price for the current unrest?
Well, it's not particularly good news coming out of Iranian Kurdistan right now. If you look at the reports, it's very difficult for journalists to get in there to actually verify what is happening. But if you get a look at some of the reports coming out from witnesses, from social media, from human rights organizations, the situation there is pretty dire. This is a map showing where in yellow or situation is the worst in Iranian Kurdistan, particularly in some of the towns. Mahabad, which is reported to be completely surrounded today by Iranian forces, also in Bana and in Sananjaz, which are the three main cities there. There are reports that tanks and combat helicopters and heavy weaponry and also snipers are opening fire on the protesters there, but they say they're not going to give in. They're going to carry on fighting. Now, this is not the only region of Iran where there has been a real clampdown. Also in the southeast of the country, in Balochistan, we've seen a clampdown against protesters there. But this, as we know now over the past few weeks, has spread to the whole of the country. The reason that the Iranian regime is pinpointing its efforts on Iranian Kurdistan, I think there are two reasons for this. The first one, you mentioned it in your introduction, which is where Mahsa Amini actually came from. That was where her funeral took place. That was where there's been a lot of widespread defiance against the Iranian regime. And I think the second one is that the Iranian regime knows that the Kurds, the Iranian Kurds, are more willing to rise up and fight against them than maybe other members of the population. There is a long-term memory amongst Iranian Kurds that the situation in their region is difficult. They have been systematically discriminated against. They have been called in more often, arrested, humiliated, and there is a feeling that it just takes a spark for protests to start again to complain against the Iranian regime. A lot of animosity against that regime, certainly since it came to power back in 1979. There's been a tweet which has been sent out by an organization for human rights called Hengor, which is defending human rights in Kurdistan, which said that as of this morning, this is yesterday morning, the 22nd of November, military helicopters are patrolling the streets of Kurdistan, which leads one to believe that the situation there is very difficult right now. The good news for the Kurds in Iranian Kurdistan is that they are getting a lot of strong support from the rest of the country, from other protesters around the country who say, we're not going to let you fall. We are there to defend you. We're also there to defend the memory of Mahsa Amini, who was the woman who died at the hands of the morality police in Iran back on the 17th of September. So this is a movement that I think the Iranian regime is trying to separate into one saying these are terrorists, these are protesters, but this is nothing to do with the rest of the protest movement in Iran, and that will be easier to keep under control in that way, which has not prevented them also from firing against groups who've gone over the border into Iraqi Kurdistan to try to seek protection there as well. So quite a lot of repression at the moment taking place.
Now, Philip, despite that repression, despite the fact that it's now been well over 2 months, the protests are still going strong, aren't they?
Yeah, we've got some figures for you just to underline how dire the situation is in Iran for those protesters. As I was saying, 9 weeks of protests, 17,450 arrests, 434 people killed. Now, that's a figure according to the human rights activist news agency HRANA, which is based in Iran. That's a higher figure than the 300 that the UN Human Rights Commission has issued, but the human rights activists in Iran agency says 60 children are also amongst those victims. Now, there have been some quite extraordinary protests taking place. Remember this week earlier, this week we saw the Iranian national team at the World Cup, which refused to sing the national anthem of Iran. We've seen two prominent Iranian actresses who have gone on Twitter. They have taken off their headscarves to say they support the protest. It appears they've since been arrested. But the bad news is that the revolutionary courts in Iran have handed out more death sentences in the last few days now. At least 20 people example, are facing the death sentence in Iran for taking part in these protests. They've been given what have been described as sham trials with no access to lawyers and physically intimidated before they were put on trial. And one other really quite horrible story which has come out of Iran over the last few hours is that the security forces are now stealing the dead bodies, the victims of the protests, from their families to try to intimidate the families and use them as bargaining chips to keep the families quiet. That in a way of trying to quell the protests. So I don't think we're going to see any calming of the protests at the moment, but visibly the Iranian authorities are quite worried about the situation, and that's why they're stepping up the repression.
Now, Philip, in light of all of these dire conditions that you've just described, how has or can the international community respond?
That is the difficult one. Now, if you look at the latest news coming out of Iran this morning, the International Atomic Energy Agency says that Iran's begun enriching uranium at 60% purity. This is just one step away at 90% when they can start producing heavy weaponry and move towards creating a nuclear weapon. These discussions are ongoing with the international community, and I think there is reticence on their behalf to get really involved in supporting the protesters because they don't want to jeopardize their chances of reaching some kind of deal with the Iranians over the nuclear enrichment program. So there has been a slight reticence, but that doesn't mean the US has stepped up to say they're going to loosen up internet connections in Iran, for example. The EU, the UK, Canada, they've all announced more sanctions against Iranian officials. But I think the general feeling is that this would be moving in to take control of a situation which is within a country itself, and it's up to that country to deal with that situation. But there are growing calls right now by human rights organisations, 43 so far, for the UN Human Rights Council to hold an emergency session on Iran. That might be upcoming in the next few days, hopefully. But for the moment, I think the protesters know the international community is supporting them, but that support is really coming from quite a long way off and no real guarantee of support for them on the ground.
And they continue nonetheless. Philip Turle, thank you very much.